All right, so my talk tonight is education versus indoctrination. But to begin, I want to set the mood. That is, I want to provide a few local examples, what we might consider indoctrination. Currently, we have visually pornographic books available in our libraries that elementary students can access. Is that a form of indoctrination? We have a director of education who actually hired a drag queen to come and speak to students about math. Is that a form of indoctrination? These are some of the examples that we don't even have time to get into. Again, I've referenced other sources, but where I find myself today, am I trying to teach you, I'm a professor. Am I trying to share with you the idea that education is good and indoctrination is bad? At the beginning, I thought, as I was preparing this speech, maybe that's what I'm doing. But then I got a bit confused, because as I began to explore the definitions, I saw that very often education and indoctrination can appear to be the same thing. I looked at the definition of education, and being educated is the process of receiving instruction meant to inform and guide one's thoughts and actions. Fair enough. But what is indoctrination? Well, being indoctrinated is the process of receiving instruction meant to inform and guide one's thoughts and actions. And I reviewed hundreds. We have Wikipedia, we have the internet. You can review hundreds of these definitions, and I did. And what I found was the similarities are uncanny. But this is what I did determine. For all those definitions, the main difference is that indoctrination is education that we do not like. Now stay with me here. I'll say it again. Indoctrination is education that we don't like. In particular, we don't like it for our kids. It's instruction that is guiding the thoughts and actions of our children in a direction that we think is incorrect and even harmful. Now, of course, as Jeff has already intimated, there is a subtle difference as well. If you look at enough definitions, you'll see that indoctrination implies something else. It implies that only one side of the issue is revealed. It's a very one-sided kind of education. But we get into a problem again, because you know what? Sometimes education is just one-sided. Sometimes education just gives us a single way of knowing. Let me give you an example. In a math class, when the math teacher says 2 + 2 = 4, most of us would be happy that he stopped there. Now, ironically, many are not stopping there. You see, now we're hearing that 2 + 2 = 4 is actually Western imperialism, and it's just one way of knowing, and I'm not kidding. But we'd be all right if he stopped. Well, what about in other areas? Let's go to science class. Think of that science teacher who, without any counterclaim, says that women and men are biologically different, even to the level of our chromosomes. Let's face it, not a single person, well, I'm assuming, I know where your minds are, not a single person would object. But many progressives, in fact, many teachers in our classroom, we heard teachers in our classrooms would object to that science lesson. Certainly our own director of education would probably object to that. G1 Chanika would object. How do I know? Because in his official pronouncements from the board, he's actually stopped using the word women, instead preferring the term menstruators to describe those people with XX chromosomes. He would consider my science lesson indoctrination, not education. So where does that leave us? Again, we're back at the notion that indoctrination is education that we personally don't like or agree with. Therefore, we say we don't want our public schools to indoctrinate our children. When we say that, we are actually saying this: we don't want our public schools to educate our children in ways that we personally believe are harmful or wrong. And listen, that is enough. It's okay to have that belief. In fact, as a parent, you should. That argument, enough, alone is enough. Because as a parent, it is your right. As a parent, it is actually your responsibility to guide the intellectual and moral growth of your kids. You don't need any other argument but that. Historically speaking, that has been enough. In fact, when we look at governments who took away the right of parents to teach their kids their moral values and what they decided was the best education, we look at those governments now and we say, you took away that right? You are evil. Our education system seems to be wanting to take away that right. Now, I've told you that you don't have to have other arguments, but I'm going to give you other arguments as well. Why we should be looking into alternatives, why we should be looking for change. This goes beyond just what we like and what we don't like. In fact, it's definitely the case that many of the ideas being promoted in our schools are not equally valid to others. Again, I'm grateful for my colleague Jeff, who came up here and he gave us some examples of historical inaccuracies. We know that some of the things our kids are being taught are empirically false and morally compromised. But we find ourselves at this spot in our history of the West where it's even more difficult for us. Because now empirical evidence and tested moral virtue are often no longer used to judge the best idea. As bizarre as this sounds, we're at a place in history where empirical evidence is sometimes seen as a bad thing. It's now equated with racism or white supremacy. And I want to give you an example from just the last year where this really appeared in striking contrast or in striking color. We heard amongst our group that there was the teaching of white privilege in our school system. Now, white privilege has been thoroughly debunked. It is not a scientific notion. It is an ideological notion. But it was being taught in our school system. And on behalf of some parents, I did a delegation. And what I did was I gathered research, the best empirical research showing that not only did white privilege not create unity, as it was said to be doing by the teachers who were bringing it to the attention of their kids, it actually caused disunity. It caused harm. It made people be angry with each other. It made people hate poor whites more. Anyway, I brought that information. I brought it to our school board. And one school teacher who's currently employed with our board even to this day, she let it be known on social media that the information, the research, the empirical evidence that I had presented should not be listened to. And the reason was this: it was probably produced by white people. Now, I say that to you because that's dangerous thinking. That's not the kind of thinking that you want in an educational institution. Here's something else that worries me even more. After I'd done my delegation, after I'd shown the majority of our trustees that this was a problem, they did nothing. Yes, we have a few fantastic trustees who are consistently trying to support the rights of parents. We have one of them here today, Cindy Watson. We also, Bill's here too, thank you. But the fact that the majority of trustees did nothing in the face of this evidence should be a worry to us all, because what we see here is that it's no longer the case that you can prove what idea is best with empirical evidence. Your opponent will classify your empirical evidence as a form of bigotry that must be rejected. How can you change a system when those controlling it will not let facts change their agenda? Can there be change? A year ago, I might have had a different answer. But truly, I think that chances of change in our public system are slim. So where does this leave us? We've concluded that we have people in our education system who won't listen to the facts. We know that as parents, we should stand up to those things that we see as wrong or harmful to our kids. Should we depend on the government then? I've got some bad news for you. our current conservative government, progressive conservative government under Doug Ford, among the provincial governments that are conservative, has shown the least interest in actually doing what conservative parents want, or parents generally, classical liberal parents. Even though survey after survey shows that conservative voters want to have educational choice, Stephen Lecce and Doug Ford are not listening. If you're pinning your hopes on them, they will go unheeded. So what do we know? We know that instead, our political leaders sit back and they watch as radical ideas like gender ideology, radical gender ideology increases, as divisive critical race theory increases, and even as hostility and violence in our school increases. There was a report in National Review magazine. It's typically out of the US, but so many freaky things have been happening in Canada, they decided to send a reporter here. They did an investigative report on violence in Ontario schools. It's never been higher. And our politicians sit back. You know what is not increasing? Basic knowledge. Basic knowledge is not increasing in our schools. In 2021, 2022, less than half of grade 6 students in Ontario in our public schools were under the provincial standard for math. Oh, sorry, less than half met the provincial standard for math. And that was a noticeable decline from previous years. Among grade 9 students, that decline was even more rapid. In that same year, 21-22, only 52% of students met the provincial standard for math, down from 75% 3 years earlier. Now, those are the government's own figures. We have international organizations that have been monitoring what's going on in Ontario as well. The Program for International Student Assessment, known as PISA, has been studying Ontario for the last 20 years. It actually looks at many countries and provinces and states within countries. And here's what they found. When measuring the outcomes at age 15 in our public school and then age 23 of those who have graduated, in the last 2 decades, our students have seen an overall 30-point drop in reading, a 35-point drop in mathematics, and about a 20-point drop in science. It's all moving in the wrong direction. And this has occurred as the funding for students, individual funding per student, has increased. We're now at about $13,500 per student. Could you imagine what an independent school could do with just a fraction of that money? Well, we don't have to imagine, because Statistics Canada has done that research for us. It's run the numbers and it gives this conclusion. Students who attend independent schools score significantly higher than public school students on reading, mathematics, and in science at age 15, and have higher levels of educational attainment by age 23. Now, the researchers at StatsCan will say, and they're very cautious about this, they say, we want to recognize that students who go to private schools often come from wealthier families, so therefore that could be a factor. They could be getting extra resources that other students aren't getting. But when you dig into the other studies outside of Statistics Canada, you see that even local independent schools perform better than public schools. And in fact, there is an exceptional standard set by independent schools that are faith-based. So here's what Cardis think tank has found. Cardis think tank, it's a research institute, it's out of Hamilton, and they've studied this extensively. The folks at Cardis have determined that youth students who are attending independent schools that are faith-based, that are of the same faith as their family, significantly outperform students going to public school. And that is for non-elite schools. That's for the homegrown school, the homegrown independent school that is faith-based, that has kids of the same faith. They do better than the public school students, and it goes beyond that. Not only do they perform academically better, they have greater levels of social benevolence. Again, this is from Cardis. This is from a study that they did. It's 2012, but I couldn't find anything newer, and I don't think the data is that dated. So let me tell you the title of this if you want to look it up yourself. It was a study called Measuring Non-Governmental School Effects in Service of the Canadian Public Good. What a great title, In Service of the Canadian Public Good. Here's what they found. Students of faith who attend independent Christian schools aligned with their beliefs, in addition to outperforming public school students academically, also outperform them in terms of social benevolence. How? First, they are significantly more likely to volunteer in their congregations, and these graduates also volunteer more for neighborhood and civic groups, the type of group that caters to the social needs of the community. Soup kitchens, reading programs, programs that we would want our children to be involved in because it shows the depth of good character. So we've got smarter kids, kinder kids going to these independent schools. That's a fantastic combination. I'm going to pour a little bit of cold water on this because we may have some people who have kids in Catholic school here. Sadly, Catholic schools in Ontario are now publicly funded, unless you're at an independent one, which most are not. Cardis has found that students who are attending Catholic schools that are government funded have the exact same profile as all other public school students. They do not do better academically. They are not more socially benevolent. In fact, they are not even more religiously committed than the average public school student. So if you thought that publicly funded Catholic schools were on average better than other public schools, there's no evidence of that. I've got a little bit more terrible news for the public schools. It seems that almost every kind of educational forum produces better results, and homeschooling is no exception. That is to say that homeschooled kids, on average, have stronger academic performance than public school kids. I'm relying on some data out of the National Homeschooling Network out of the US, but it's peer-reviewed. I'll just give you, I'm mindful of my time, so I'll just give you some of the highlights. Here's one thing that struck me. The research proves that on average, a homeschooling mom or dad with no post-secondary degree, a homeschooling mom or dad who finished high school gets better results on average than public school teachers. This is some data from the Academic Leadership Journal. It's a peer-reviewed journal. They did the largest study of homeschooling outcomes. It found that homeschool kids typically score 15 to 25 percentile points above public school students on standard academic achievement tests. They also found that homeschool students score above average on achievement tests regardless of their parents' level of formal education, as I've already said. Other peer-reviewed work has found the same thing. Let me talk about a bit of anecdotal evidence as I move toward the close of my talk. I've had homeschooled kids in my classes at Wilfrid Laurier, and I can tell you this. It's anecdotal, but I can tell you this. Some of them are my top academic performers, but to the letter, to the nth degree, to the last one, they are always the most polite and conscientious. I mention that because it's important. Because right now there is a movement to try to outlaw homeschooling in the United States. I'm not kidding. The head of, she is the head of child advocacy for the law school at Harvard. Her name is Elizabeth, I can't remember her last name, Bartholaw, I think. She has advocated that homeschooling be made illegal in the United States. She's a very powerful voice. And her rationale was that you're just not well socialized. It turns you into someone who's an introverted, unsocial, I can think of other epithets, monster. She hasn't said monster, I'm exaggerating. But here's the truth. When the empirical evidence is examined about the socialization of homeschool kids, here's what's found. This is a quote from a meta-analysis. There is an overwhelming amount of evidence that children socialized in peer-dominant environments, like public schools, are at a higher risk for developing social maladjustment issues than those who are socialized in parent-monitored environments like homeschool. That is to say, you're more socially well-adjusted by going homeschool. All right, so that's about 20 minutes of me talking. I'm going to finish up. Have I given you any insights? I'll be honest. Here's what I hope. Here's what I hope you're going to take away from my talk. I hope you realize that the leaders in our public school don't think that they are doing anything wrong. Despite all the evidence of the radical ideas that they're pushing on your kids, they don't think they're indoctrinating them. They think they are educating them. On the other hand, they think that the values and ideas that you have, if they don't align with radical gender ideology, if they don't align with critical race theory, they think that you are indoctrinating them. In fact, they believe they need to rescue your children from you. So they're not going to change. This is my assessment, but I don't believe they're going to change because they're convinced that they are the good guys. I also hope you realize that the government has shown no sign that it cares about this, and I don't expect that they're going to try and fix it. But I hope you heard that you are not powerless. I hope you heard that there are options available. And not only are there options available, but the research says they are better for your kids. And that's good news. But there is bad news. And the bad news is that those better options will require more money from you. And if you do homeschooling, more time from you. And that is not fair. But what choice do you have? Will you wait for it to get worse? And what can worse look like? How bad does public education have to be before you will act? And I realize that if you act, it will be a sacrifice. As a parent, if you leave public education, it will lead to greater suffering for you in terms of money and time. But in this scenario, I really believe that suffering is inevitable. The only choice is whether it will be you suffering or your kids. Thank you.